Data from the report and your comments is being used to develop our plan. You can access it using the QR code or going to our website. Next slide, please. What you'll see in the report, in the last piece of the report, is that we're breaking our planning down into 4 focus areas: environmental justice, waste criteria, waste and disposal reduction, and capacity planning. Today really is in the waste and disposal reduction. For the report, if you're interested in that specifically, I would recommend looking at section 6. Section 1 and 2, section 1 is more of an intro. It's good to get a background. 2 is generation, and 3 2 and 3 would also provide context. So 2, 3, and 6, if you're really interested in the waste and disposal reduction piece. Okay, so today is on pollution prevention. Sorry. Pollution prevention has been an important goal of DTSC for decades. DTSC's program was established in the 1980s, and changes were made to these articles in 2012, which made the implementation of the requirements of the pollution prevention program, made them discretionary and contingent upon funding. Now, these statutory changes were made during the reorganization of DTSC's P2 program, really between 2012 and 2013, when the P2 resources and staff were redirected to start the Safer Consumer Products program. Now, since that shift, there's been a hole in the hazardous waste management program because resources have not been available to provide a function that had been previously provided. Now, the function was the evaluation of waste generators and waste reduction efforts. DTSC had developed a deep understanding of numerous waste generation processes and was able to provide technical support to hazardous waste generators to make recommendations for their waste reduction efforts. Now, there has been a lot of interest in redeveloping that knowledge base so the department can again help really foster and drive waste reduction. Regaining the knowledge by evaluation of information and data that hasn't been utilized in over a decade regarding topics like source reduction can provide a means to really help bolster waste reduction. Now, this will allow a targeted and intentional waste reduction approach to be developed that's focused on specific industry sectors or waste streams, rather than establishing just a general reduction goal that's based on an overall percentage of the waste reduced. This targeted approach may result in more direct positive impacts on environmental justice communities. It will be important to consider more efficient and sustainable strategies for managing waste, such as on-site treatment, on and off-site recycling, pollution prevention, safer alternative products, and encouraging a more robust circular economy in California. So as we go through today's information, I encourage you to think about how you would reimagine pollution prevention, what you would focus the program on, and how could a new P2 program, pollution prevention is also termed P2, how could a new P2 program really best serve California? Next slide, please. There's a number of opportunities that we've identified in planning. 3 are up here on the screen. And as we go through today, keep in mind what the questions that I just asked, and that there's numerous opportunities. We're going to talk about 3 of them that we've identified. And with that, I will turn it over to Kayla and Karen, and they will take us through today's presentation.
Thanks, Ryan. Next slide, please. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kayla Kuhl. I'm a hazardous substances engineer with the Hazardous Waste Management Plan unit, and I'm joined by Karen Peng, an environmental scientist with the unit. And we will be talking about Revisiting and Reimagining Pollution Prevention. And as Ryan mentioned, pollution prevention is often called P2. Next slide, please. The purpose of this workshop is to first share the history of DTSC's former P2 program. This program had a long history, but it's been disbanded for over a decade at this point, so a lot of what the program did has been forgotten. From there, we can use the past to inform the future and discuss ideas for DTSC's future waste and disposal reduction efforts. We also want to receive public feedback on these topics. DTSC's previous P2 program was very public-facing, and we want public feedback to help guide future efforts. Next slide, please. So for today, we'll start off discussing the definition of pollution prevention, which is surprisingly complicated. And from there, we'll be discussing the history of DTSC's P2 unit and the subsequent disbanding of the P2 unit and the creation of the Safer Consumer Products Program, or SCP. We'll do a quick review of what areas of pollution prevention SB 158 requires the Hazardous Waste Management Plan to examine. And then we'll finish it off with a discussion of what considerations we've made for determining reduction priorities and ideas for future efforts if DTSC was to reimagine a new P2 program. Next slide, please. Let's start off with the definition of pollution prevention, because that term can actually be used in different ways. When not on a technical level, I think it's very common to consider pollution prevention to be the prevention of uncontrolled releases of hazardous wastes or substances. So you would call like preventing an oil spill in the ocean to be pollution prevention, or preventing the illegal dumping of hazardous waste. However, the official definition of pollution prevention isn't about preventing the release of hazardous waste directly into the environment, so much as it is about preventing the creation of the hazardous waste in the first place. Next slide, please. Even when discussing pollution prevention on a technical level, there's actually two different official definitions. The US EPA defines pollution prevention as any practice that reduces, eliminates, or prevents pollution at its source before it is created. According to the US EPA, pollution prevention is exactly the same thing as source reduction. Source reduction is defined as any practice which reduces the amount of any hazardous substance prior to recycling, treatment, or disposal. So in this context, pollution prevention does not include treatment or most recycling. However, there's just a little bit of a gray area here in typically recycling within a process is considered source reduction. So say you have a chemical process and it's a continuous system of pipes, tanks, and it is recycling solvent right back into the process instead of sending that solvent to waste and only using new solvent. Because it stays within the same process unit of pipes and tanks, that is considered source reduction. And on the other hand, though, if you were to remove the solvent from the system, send it offsite to be distilled or processed in whatever way is needed, and then bring the solvent right back to use again, that would not be considered source reduction because the hazardous waste has still been created in that case. Next slide, please. To further define source reduction, it can include things like operational improvements, production process changes, and product reformulations. So basically any practice that facilities can implement to lead to less generation of hazardous waste. Now, what source reduction is not are actions taken after the hazardous waste has already been generated, actions that just concentrate the constituents in order to reduce the volume of them, actions that dilute the hazardous waste, and actions that just move hazardous waste from one medium to another, such as from soil to water. Lastly, source reduction is not the treatment of hazardous waste, as once again, this does not reduce generation at the source. I just wanted to point out, if you've attended our previous workshop on data harmonization, you have seen the slide before. We just wanted to reshare it since it's relevant to pollution prevention as well. Next slide, please. Article 11.9, also known as SB 14, did not follow the strict EPA definition that pollution prevention only includes source reduction. The statute reads that pollution prevention means the reduction of chemical sources that have adverse impacts on public health and the environment, including, but not limited to, source reduction. In this context, recycling and treatment are still pollution prevention because they still reduce chemical sources. If you recycle hazardous waste back into processes, now you both don't have to treat or dispose of that hazardous waste, and you require fewer raw materials, which in hazardous waste generating industries are usually hazardous substances. And I just want to quickly point out here that recycling can be a form of treatment, but typically we mention recycling and treatment separately on the waste management hierarchy, since recycling is the most preferred form of treatment. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to say which definition is better, though the previous definition that I gave is certainly the more commonly used one that equates pollution prevention to only source reduction. That being said, DTSC's pollution prevention program did also include research into recycling and treatment, even though source reduction was the primary focus. So it effectively embraced the second broader definition of pollution prevention. Recycling and treatment still have a lot of value in waste management. So whether or not the term pollution prevention strictly includes recycling and treatment, we still recommend that those concepts be included in a waste reduction strategy. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Karen.
Hello, I'm Karen Pang, environmental scientist, and thank you again to Kayla for introducing what pollution prevention is. So now I'll be going into the history of DTSC's pollution prevention program, also known as the P2 program. Oh, sorry, next slide. And the next slide again, sorry about that. Alrighty, so let's start off with the two laws that served as the foundations of the P2 program in California. So the first is the Health and Safety Code, Article 11.8, and it's also known as the Hazardous Waste Reduction, Recycling, and Treatment Research and Demonstration Act of 1985. And the intent of this article was stated to promote technologies that eliminate or reduce hazardous waste generated, and when that is impossible, to promote technologies that recycle and treat hazardous waste. Now, the focus of the article was to establish a grant program, particularly the Hazardous Waste Technology Research, Development, and Demonstration Program. And as its name entails, this program provided grants to universities, governmental agencies, as well as private organizations for the research, development, and demonstration of hazardous waste reduction, recycling, and as well as different treatment technologies. And while there were some amounts of cost sharings for these grants, DTSC did pay for a majority of the costs. And the overarching goal of the program was essentially to develop commercially successful technologies. And if that was done, the grant was to be repaid, and DTSC would receive a percentage of any royalties derived from that technology. And while there were many grants that were given, at this time, we have not been able to determine if any of them were ever commercially successful enough to the point that DTSC got paid back for that grant. Another aspect of Article 11.8 is a reporting requirement for generators, and this requirement is notably still in effect, as it doesn't require any funding from DTSC. So Article 11.8 also established a requirement for generators to submit a biennial report that state the changes in volume and the toxicity of waste achieved for that reporting period. Next slide, please. So the next one is Article 11.9, and it's officially titled the Pollution Prevention and Hazardous Waste Source Reduction and Management Review Act. However, it's often more commonly referred to just as SB 14. And Essentially, this article was intended to promote the hazardous waste management hierarchy. And in this waste management hierarchy, hazardous waste is to be reduced at the source whenever possible, which means not creating or generating any hazardous waste at all. And if source reduction is not possible, then the hazardous waste is to be recycled. And then lastly, if neither reduction nor recycling of hazardous waste is possible, then the waste is to be treated. Article 11.9 also created new programs to assist in these goals. So for one, it established a pollution prevention advisory committee. The article also created a technical assistance program to assist different businesses in P2 opportunities, especially for small businesses that may have otherwise not have had the resources to pursue these opportunities. Another program that 11.9 created was the California Green Business Program, which helped provide support to local governments and also help certify small businesses. Now, unfortunately, most of what Article 11.9 established, it was eventually defunded in 2012, alongside with the end of DTSC's P2 program. So the Pollution Prevention Advisory Committee was completely disbanded. DTSC no longer has a technical assistance program to promote different pollution prevention techniques for businesses. And then lastly, DTSC's Green Business Program also no longer exists. But it is notable that outside of DTSC, the Green Business Network performs many of the same functions. And the network is something that we'll be discussing a little more later on in this presentation. Now, one aspect of Article 11.9 that is still in place, though, are the reporting requirements for generators of hazardous waste. So generators are required to prepare reports on the hazardous waste that they generate, as well as the source reduction evaluation plans for this waste. And this requirement, again, is still active because it is not dependent on funding from DTSC. However, DTSC no longer reviews these reports like it did when it had an active P2 program. And I also will be discussing more about these reports, also known as SB 14 reports, later on in this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, all being said, both Articles 11.8 and 11.9, they wanted to promote pollution prevention through the waste management hierarchy. So again, source reduction is the most important aspect of pollution prevention, but recycling followed by treatment are also considered important goals. So officially, DTSC's P2 program did use the stricter definition of pollution prevention, which only includes source reduction. But in practice, recycling and reuse followed by treatment, there were also goals. So as I discussed the history of the pollution prevention program today, it can be seen how different projects targeted different aspects of the waste management hierarchy. Next slide, please. So alongside Articles 11.8 and 11.9, another important foundation of DTSC's P2 program was the Capacity Assurance Plan of 1989. So in this, the US EPA required states to prepare a document to project their hazardous waste generation for the next 20 years, as well as to prove that states had adequate capacity. And this was tied funding for the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA. And California did risk losing federal Superfund money for remedial action until the Capacity Assurance Plan was complete. However, the plan needed to only cover federal hazardous waste under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as RCRA. So it didn't need to cover non-RCRA waste, which are only hazardous in California. And it should also be noted that currently CERCLA funding continues to be tied to in-state hazardous waste capacity in California. So in the Capacity Assurance Plan, the primary way that California planned to address its capacity shortfall was largely through source reduction and recycling, and then additional capacity was supposed to be a secondary means of addressing California's capacity needs. And in the plan, it was noted that California did not have a commercial or didn't have any commercial hazardous waste incinerators, and therefore needed to send incinerable waste out of state. So the plan did mention the intent for incinerable waste reduction efforts, which I'll also go more into detail later on in this presentation. Next slide, please. All Right, so now I'd like to go over some of the historical DTSC pollution prevention programs and units. So the name of the pollution prevention group at DTSC, it definitely changed several times over the years. The Alternative Technology Division, or ATD, it began operating under this specific name in 1989, but before that, it definitely underwent several variations of the name as the program continued to grow. Next, Articles 11.8 and 11.9, which I just discussed, they were passed in 1985 and 1989, respectively. And then after that, just for some additional historical context, DTSC was not formed as a separate independent department until 1991. Now, there were some additional renames for the P2 unit, but in 1993, the Office of Pollution Prevention and Technology Development, also known as OPPTD, that office was created, and that seems to have been the name that they operated under for most of the time that P2 was active. So because the name changes so frequently during the P2 program's active period, I will be referring to them just as the Pollution Prevention Unit or the P2 unit, rather than the specific name that it was operating under at that time. And in the next slide, I will be going into the basic organization of the P2 unit, which also did change slightly over time. Next slide, please. The 1989 Capacity Assurance Plan also clearly defined the organization and components of DTSC's P2 program, because again, pollution prevention was the primary means of assuring California's hazardous waste capacity. And P2 was a large program, which back in 1989 had a total budget of $3 million. So at that time, the P2 program was comprised of three main units, the first being the waste reduction unit, the next being the resource recovery unit, and then lastly, the technology clearinghouse unit. Next slide, please. So the first was the waste reduction unit, and the major activities of the unit included managing the department's hazardous waste reduction grants program, which again was created by the Health and Safety Code Article 11.8 that I described previously. So the grant program initially had a $1 million funding budget annually, which was increased to $1.8 million annually later on. But in 1989, the grant program funded 24 projects, and these grants were awarded to applicants with matching funds, with a proportion of the matching dependent on what type of business or agency the applicant was. The waste reduction unit also created waste checklists, which helped provide assistance to some of California's smaller industries, as well as generators of small quantities of hazardous waste. And this was accomplished by DTSC funding studies to evaluate waste reduction opportunities through audits in a select number of industries. And then the unit also provided technical waste reduction assistance to a variety of different agencies and industries. And along the same vein, a later function of this unit was to review and assess SB 14 reports that were being prepared and submitted by generators. Next slide, please. The resource recovery unit focused on recycling and the recovery of resources that might have otherwise just been lost to land disposal. So the unit operated the California Waste Exchange, which was a program set up to promote their use, reuse, and exchange of industrial waste. And in just 1 year alone, 50 waste streams were recycled that would have been previously just disposed to land. Next slide, please. Now, the Technology and Clearinghouse unit, it was established to provide a focal point for the circulation of technical information on hazardous waste source reduction, recycling, as well as different treatment technologies and strategies. So the goal was to ensure that any party interested in waste reduction, that they had the access to comprehensive information. So because of this, the unit developed a series of industry-specific waste reduction guidance documents and fact sheets. And these documents were less technically complex than the waste reduction audit reports, as they were meant for industries to be able to easily request as well as implement. For the unit's outreach efforts, they also provided training to different universities and local governments to, again, help in implementing local waste reduction programs. And then lastly, the Technology and Clearinghouse unit also acted as a contract manager to pursue federal grant money. Next slide, please. So as I described previously, within the P2 program, the Waste Reduction Unit was responsible for reviewing SB 14 reports. But again, before I begin, I would also just like to highlight that this portion on SB 14 has actually already been introduced in the previous capacity workshop. And I did want to preface that this would be a review of that information. All right, so what are SB 14 reports? As I mentioned before, the Health and Safety Code Article 11.9, which is just often more commonly known and referred to as SB 14. Under this act, applicable generators of hazardous waste prepare SB 14 reports every 4 years, and this has been a requirement since 1991. So the applicability for generators include preparing reports when more than 12,000 kilograms of hazardous waste per year, or when 12 kilograms of extremely hazardous waste per year is being generated. And additionally, the information on the reporting format and requirements of SB 14 reports that I'll be discussing in this section, they are based on a portion of the current regulatory requirement. So therefore, I won't be covering the reporting requirements for small businesses today. Next slide, please. So SB 14 reports generally consist of 3 different types of documents. So the first being the Source Reduction Evaluation Review and Plan, often known as just a plan. And this is a prospective document that details the facility's operation, waste generation data by waste stream, as well as a discussion on the different source reduction measures and their feasibility. The next is the Summary Progress Report, also known as the SPR. And this document discusses a facility's progress in implementing said source reduction measures. And then lastly, the Hazardous Waste Management Performance Report, known as just the report. This is a retrospective document that discusses waste stream management for that reporting year. The SPRs were required by every generator to be submitted to DTSC for each reporting year, while the plan and report were submitted to DTSC under specific conditions. But all being said, all 3 documents that make up SB 14 reports were required to be prepared by every applicable generator every 4 years. Next slide, please. So the units and subcommittees within the P2 program, they worked extensively, again, with universities and organizations to support research on different types of pollution prevention technology, as well as industry techniques in California. So as I mentioned in the previous slides about the Waste Reduction and Technology and Clearinghouse units, they created industry-specific technical documents as a way to assist different businesses. And in 1991, DTSC also began to select industry categories for review, specifically for the development of industry assessment reports. And this was an additional process to the requirement of a SPR submission that every generator needed to follow. Now, SB 14 reports and plans that were being requested, they were reviewed for proper preparation and completion, which included a process that often involved interacting with the facility personnel, as well as even site visits by DTSC staff. And this was a great way for DTSC staff to provide direct technical and regulatory assistance to these facilities. The data that was being gathered through the review of these SB 14 reports, they allowed DTSC to conduct industry and cross-industry assessments, and then later on to share this type of knowledge through different publications, workshops, and conferences, which again ultimately created a much more direct line of communication between facilities and generators with DTSC. Next slide, please. Now, between 1991 and 1998, the P2 unit analyzed 833 of these SB 14 reports. So they were definitely constantly studying these documents as they came in. And the waste reduction progress that industries made during this time, of course, with the assistance of P2's technical guidance, they were very impressive. So in a 4-year span from 1990 through 1994, for the facilities whose source reduction documents were analyzed, it was found that the petroleum industry reduced offsite waste shipments by 32%, the polymers and resins manufacturing industry by 27%, the chemical products manufacturers and biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry by 17%. And then lastly, the paint manufacturing industry was able to reduce their solvent waste by 40%. So all being said, it is important to note that these statistics are only from facilities that had their SB14 reports analyzed. And it should also be considered that many of these companies had very poor waste reduction practices prior to SB14, and therefore was able to very easily implement these reductions, which because of that, it doesn't necessarily indicate that they could continue to achieve similar reduction rates for each subsequent reporting period. But all that being considered, it is still very impressive, the accomplishments and the reduction rates, as it was a very short period of time. Next slide, please. Now, the assessment of SB14 reports, they were definitely a constant task of DTSC's P2 program throughout its history, but now I will be going to discuss some of the individual projects that they worked on. So over the years, they worked on many projects. Some were successful and some not as much, but they definitely all had the common goal of innovation and improvement. And before we begin, it's also important to note that these technologies will still be subject to the law. So some of the technologies that they tested may have required additional permits from either DTSC or the CUPAs if they were ever conducted at full scale, which definitely does put their implementation feasibility into perspective. Next slide, please. So let's start off with a major success of the P2 program, the Incinerable Waste Minimization Project. So since, as we mentioned previously, since there's no commercial hazardous waste incinerators in California, all waste requiring incineration, it must be shipped out of state. So because of this, incinerable waste was noted as a focus area for reduction in the 1989 Capacity Assurance Report. And because of this, it also became a major project for the P2 program. So of the 57 facilities generating incinerable waste that were identified as top priority, 39 signed a volunteer agreement to work with DTSC in exchange for technical and regulatory assistance. By 1992, those 39 participating facilities had reduced incinerable waste generation by 53% compared to the numbers in 1987. So numerically, this was around from 92,000 tons of incinerable waste reduced to around 43,000 tons. And these generators were able to reduce their incinerable waste in a variety of ways. So for example, one aircraft company used a corrosion-resistant paint that required the use of a catalyst and therefore had a shelf life of only around 8 hours. And paint that was not being used within this time frame had to be disposed of. So because less than 2 ounces of paint was actually being used per shift, typically, the company was able to switch from a 4-ounce to a 2-ounce paint container, therefore reducing the amount of unused paint that was being wasted. The significant reduction of incinerable waste was a major success for these businesses, especially those that participated in this project. So it was also a very successful project for the P2 program as a whole. Next slide, please. As I described previously, when I was talking about the waste reduction unit, the P2 program also contracted with different universities and consultants to develop industry-specific waste audits for small businesses like auto paint shops or metal finishing shops. So from those audits, 13 checklist handbooks were created, and they were intended to be used by the shop employees themselves to help determine if they were conducting their businesses using best practices for waste reduction. Now, some of these suggestions seem very intuitive, like having a first in and first out material usage policy to decrease the chances of materials expiring before it can be used. But especially early on in the P2 program, many of these shops didn't have any of these practices. And small businesses also didn't have dedicated staff to focus just on efficiency. So DTSC definitely served as a direct resource for them. And these handbooks continue to be updated and also evolved over the years. In fact, later checklists also included basic information about compliance, such as not sending hazardous waste down a drain. And again, these handbooks were ultimately very popular and definitely were a money-saving resource for these businesses because even after the P2 program ended, DTSC was actually still receiving requests for these handbooks, which just show how useful they were for businesses. Next slide, please. Another example of a P2 program that comes from Article 11.8 was specifically a grant program. So this grant program was not trivial. Again, it started off with a $1 million yearly budget, which later grew to $1.8 million. And the grant money went to projects conducted by third parties that worked with DTSC. And again, for this grant project, there was a cost sharing aspect, but the amount of money that the third party had to provide, it was proportionate to the type of businesses. So it was often lowered for small businesses and other governmental agencies. So one example of a grant project was a solvent purification project for dry cleaners. So the company tested several different types of methods for purifying perchloroethylene, also known as PCE or PERC. And this was a chemical that was commonly used in dry cleaners in the past. So they determined that a combination of two methods could recycle 95% of the solvent with a 99.7% purity. And this project, or this recycling project, was projected to be very cost efficient with only a 10-month payback period if the recycling was ever conducted using full-scale equipment. However, at this time, there is no information on whether or not this recycling project was ever brought to full scale. However, it should also be noted that PCE is now banned for use in dry cleaning, specifically in California. So this project wouldn't have been applicable today. Next slide, please. Another series of projects conducted by the P2 unit, they were the remedial technology demonstration projects, and they studied contaminated soil treatment technologies at different specific sites. Next slide, please. One example was a soil cleanup for a diesel contaminated site. Notably here, the diesel contaminated site was contaminated, but not necessarily considered hazardous waste. So the project utilized a modified asphalt recycling unit to heat the contaminated soil to around 600 degrees Fahrenheit and to burn the diesel from the soil. The recycling unit was attached to emissions control trailer. And if you can see on the slide, the diagram showed the schematics for the two trailers. So the project was successful in destroying diesel, but the off gas that it produced still contained diesel fumes. And they were essentially operating a portable incinerator, which isn't necessarily what people prefer when it comes to on-site treatment options. But again, this project specifically demonstrates the range of projects that the P2 program was working on. Next slide, please. Another example of a hazardous waste reduction technology demonstration project was one that investigated whether boiler fly ash could be used in cement manufacturing to eliminate the need for the disposal of it as a hazardous waste. While the project was proven to be technically successful, the cost of using fly ash in comparison with other raw materials was just not feasible. And another hindrance was that the use of fly ash in cement may have been prohibited by the use constituting disposal regulations. And these are regulations that prohibit any sort of use of hazardous waste going into a product that is then applied to the ground. So in this case, it would be the cement. So as a result, fly ash was only used in cement for the duration of the demonstration project, but its use was discontinued after the demonstration was complete. So this project specifically is an example of one that was not as successful. And we thought that it was important to discuss both extremely successful projects, such as the incinerable waste minimization project, alongside projects that were not as successful to be able to get a full picture of DTSC's P2 program. Next slide, please. Aside from specific projects, the DTSC P2 program was also very public facing. So for example, every year there was a P2 week that was being held by the P2 team, and it helped formulate action plans with other agencies, but it also helped serve as a form of public outreach. So representatives were also sent to participate in the national P2 roundtable conferences. But while the P2 week is no longer being held by DTSC, the Pollution Prevention Roundtable still serves as a national P2 conference. And to this day, there are some DTSC staff that occasionally attend these roundtables. Next slide, please. The 1999 Pollution Prevention Accomplishments Report provided a good summary of the P2 team's different outreach efforts. So in a span of only 2 years, the P2 program was able to provide 60 workshops on waste reduction, with over 2,700 people attending these workshops. P2 also provided a wealth of publications on waste reduction, such as the waste reduction checklist for small businesses that I mentioned earlier. And again, these publications were not stagnant, and instead they were being continuously updated and evolving, and therefore they were very popular and often distributed at a large scale annually. And P2 also worked closely with local agencies who were responsible for the direct oversight and inspection of generators. And in fact, P2 trained 228 staff members in 45 of these local agencies on topics such as pollution prevention and SB 14. And they were also able to partner with different local inspection programs to help bring SB 14 violators into compliance. All being said, unfortunately, it is difficult to measure the direct impacts from these various outreach accomplishments, since unlike specific waste reduction programs, there's no tangible numbers, but it does definitely still demonstrate just how public facing the P2 program was. And through these accomplishments, it can be seen how much of an important research that the P2 program was for generators and local agencies alike. All right, I'll now be passing it back to Kayla to summarize the P2 program. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Next slide, please. So believe it or not, that was only a very brief look at what DTSC did in over 20 years of having a P2 program. It was not intended to be inclusive of all their activities, but rather just a sampling of what they worked on and what they accomplished. So let's take a step back here and kind of summarize what the DTSC P2 program was. First off, the P2 program was a knowledge base. The SB 14 reports provided information on generation and reduction efforts. So this provided a continuous source of information as to what waste was being generated and how industry was attempting to reduce the waste. They used knowledge from these reports and also from working with generators to produce publications that were an important resource to DTSC. Secondly, the P2 program was innovative. They were constantly testing new technologies, and some of those technologies worked well and some of them didn't work well. They prioritized source reduction, but they still researched all aspects of the waste management hierarchy. This allowed them to try and reduce hazardous waste disposal from multiple angles. And finally, the P2 program was very public facing. Generators worked with P2 on an entirely voluntary basis. And it's worth remembering that generators did so because if they could reduce their hazardous waste generation, they could save money. And the P2 program provided resources including trainings, workshops, and reference guides. And these were intended not only for generators, but also other government agencies or even members of the general public. Next slide, please. But I think it's also important to remember what the DTSC P2 program was not. They were not cheap. At one point, they operated 3 units with approximately 50 total staff members. They had at one point 3 million yearly in contract funds alone. So they were able to achieve very successful projects, but this was not a small operation with a very minimal budget. They were also not going to eliminate hazardous waste generation. Most projects were focused and specific, instead of having broad goals, like, say, wanting to reduce hazardous waste generation by 50%. These projects didn't necessarily have a large impact on the overall amount of hazardous waste being generated, but instead targeted specific hazardous waste streams in specific industries. Also, recycling and treatment were considered important goals of the program, so they didn't only look at eliminating hazardous waste generation at the source. And finally, they were not punitive. Generators were legally obligated to produce the SB14 reports that Karen described earlier, but they weren't obligated to reduce hazardous waste by a certain amount. Also, because DTSC's pollution prevention team was not the same as the inspection team, generators felt more comfortable sharing their processes instead of worrying about getting cited for violations. The P2 program worked entirely off of having good relations with generators who wanted to work with them, because hazardous waste generation is expensive, so they had an incentive to reduce it. Next slide, please. So now that we've discussed the history of DTSC's P2 program, let's move on to the transition to SCP, or the Safer Consumer Products Program. Next slide. In 2008, the Green Chemistry Initiative was passed, but no additional resources were provided to fund this initiative. It was decided that resources would be redirected from the Pollution Prevention Program to fund the new Green Chemistry Initiative, and that the Pollution Prevention Program would be phased out. Because the Pollution Prevention Program would no longer be able to review SB14 reports, in July of 2012, SB 1018 was enacted and amended the SB 14 programs and reporting requirements for generators. SB 1018 deleted the requirements for DTSC to select generators every 2 years to assess their plan and report. As a result, generators were no longer required to submit any SB 14 reports to DTSC. However, generators do still prepare reports to this day, as they are required to, but they only need to keep their records on site and have them available upon request. Once the P2 unit was disbanded between 2012 and 2013, the Safer Consumer Products, or SCP unit, was formed in 2013 using those resources that had previously funded the P2 unit. Now, the Safer Consumer Products Program did not continue pollution prevention initiatives and is not responsible for source reduction or SB14 reports. So currently, those reports can be requested by CUPAs as part of the hazardous waste generator inspection process, but there is not typically a technical evaluation on the source reduction data. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the Safer Consumer Products Program for a bit. Why was it formed? Consumer products are in close contact with people. Since things like cosmetics are applied directly to the skin, many of these products don't undergo any sort of safety testing prior to use. So SCP has a stated goal of reducing hazardous chemicals in consumer products by increasing adoption of green chemistry principles and safer alternatives. SCP also reduces regrettable substitution of one hazardous chemical with an equally hazardous chemical by requiring an alternative analysis to look for safer alternatives. Next slide, please. To do this, the SCP regulatory framework establishes a 4-part process that identifies specific products containing hazardous chemicals and evaluates for safer alternatives. First, the chemicals of concern must be listed on the candidate chemicals list. This is a combination of 23 authoritative lists of chemicals of concern, including California's Prop 65, and also the International Agency for Research on Cancer's list of carcinogens. Then, product chemical combinations that have the potential to cause harm are listed as priority products. These might be products you'd find in a retail store, but they could also be products that are sold like from business to business. Examples of priority products include that are already regulated include things like children's nap mats containing certain flame retardants and paint strippers containing methylene chloride. Manufacturers of these may either conduct an alternatives analysis to look for a safer replacement chemical, or remove the chemical from the product, or remove the product from the California marketplace. Finally, depending on the outcome of the alternative analysis, SEP may impose requirements called regulatory responses. These can range from improved labeling to, say, worker training, but can include even a sales prohibition. Next slide, please. So as you can tell, even from this brief summary, SEP has different goals than P2 did. As the name implies, the Safer Consumer Products Program regulates products. Pollution prevention focused not on specific products, but on reducing hazardous waste. Products by definition are not waste, so this is a different focus area. It's also important to remember that the Safer Consumer Products Program has statutory authority that includes potentially banning the sale of a product, while the pollution prevention group couldn't mandate that hazardous waste be reduced. However, both programs seek to reduce the use of harmful chemicals. They just approach it in a different way. SEP wants to reduce the use of harmful chemicals in consumer products specifically, while pollution prevention wanted to reduce the use of harmful chemicals since they would result in the creation of hazardous waste. Next slide, please. So from there, let's move on to some of the specific requirements of the Hazardous Waste Management Plan related to pollution prevention in SB 158. Next slide, please. Statute requires the plan to include goals to reduce the amount of hazardous waste generated or disposed of. So the Hazardous Waste Management Plan is not limited to source reduction alone. SB 158 also specifies that the risk of exposure to communities threatened by releases of hazardous substances or hazardous waste should be reduced. And it very specifically says that hazardous waste generation cannot be reduced solely by not cleaning up sites that require cleanup that would reduce the amount of contaminated soil generation, but would also result in fewer sites being cleaned up. We don't recommend specific numerical goals, such as saying we want a 5% yearly reduction in hazardous waste. Instead, we have determined a recommended methodology to target certain waste streams for reduction. Next slide, please. There are many factors to consider when determining which hazardous waste streams to analyze for reduction. The following is a general framework for considerations we made when determining waste streams to analyze, and this could be applied in future hazardous waste management plans as well. The first consideration that we think should be prioritized is the potential for a waste stream to result in negative impacts to the surrounding community. A more hazardous waste stream will have greater potential impacts if mismanaged than a less hazardous waste stream. Also, generators of hazardous waste present near sensitive receptors or housing have a greater potential for community impacts than generators that are in more remote areas. The second consideration is the management capacity for that waste. Large waste streams take up limited hazardous waste management capacity, so that's inherent, but also specific waste streams that require specialized treatment may have more limited management capacity, and that capacity is potentially only located outside of California. And the third consideration we made is whether a waste stream is emerging or increasing. New processes may have greater potential for reduction because older processes may have already implemented cost-effective waste reduction techniques. Also, new waste streams may not have established treatment processes to avoid landfilling waste. So based on these three considerations, for the 2025 Hazardous Waste Management Plan, 3 areas of hazardous waste were considered for reduction. First, contaminated soil waste. Second, incinerable waste. And third, alternative energy waste. Let's talk about contaminated soil waste. Next slide, please. Even before the publication of the Hazardous Waste Management Report, we received feedback from numerous stakeholders requesting that we investigate contaminated soil generation. And that's not surprising since so much of California's hazardous waste is contaminated soil. So this graph shows the hazardous waste generation for the years between 2010 and 2021. Contaminated soil waste is in yellow, and that's the second to the top bars. That is consistently the single largest waste stream. Used oil is in gray below that, and inorganic solids are in orange at the bottom. And that blue on the top is actually all other hazardous waste streams, manifested hazardous waste streams combined besides those three largest categories. So this graph really shows how much those three largest categories dominate hazardous waste generation in California. Because contaminated soil is the largest waste stream, it's inherently going to put strain on California's existing hazardous waste management capacity. Now, just a little side note here, the official code for contaminated soil waste, 611, is actually contaminated soil from site cleanups. But this is somewhat misleading because contaminated soil can also be generated from things that are more like construction projects. So, for example, the largest generator of soil in 2021 was a utility upgrade project in San Francisco, not a cleanup. Next slide, please. To try and understand how much DTSC could theoretically influence soil generation, I've broken down site authority into three categories. The first category is projects that are outside of DTSC's oversight. And those are cleanups or construction projects generating hazardous waste soil not overseen by DTSC. This includes projects managed by other government agencies like the Water Board, but also all cleanup projects overseen by private companies or nonprofits. And this can also include things that are more like construction projects, as I mentioned on the last slide. The second category is projects under DTSC's oversight. These are cleanup projects generating contaminated soil overseen by DTSC that a third party is funding either through a voluntary agreement or an enforcement action. And these include cleanup projects where DTSC is not the only oversight agency. Some sites, especially military sites, could be overseen by DTSC, the Water Board, and the US EPA. The third category is projects managed by DTSC. These are cleanup projects generating contaminated soil, both led and funded by DTSC, because DTSC is unable to identify a viable responsible party. Now, this third category has a name. It's much more commonly called orphan sites. So what do these categories mean for us? DTSC does not have the authority to tell a privately led project or a project overseen by a different government agency that it must use treatment technologies instead of excavation. DTSC has slightly more control over projects that it oversees, but can still only ask that alternative technologies be evaluated. It can't mandate that they be used. Control is further reduced if DTSC is only one of multiple oversight agencies. The most authority is over orphan sites, since those are not funded by a third party. Next slide, please. Just to kind of get a quick look at how these authorities break down, I took 2021, that's just a sample year, and I took the top 76 sites generating contaminated soil in this year. And those 76 sites generated 80% of the contaminated soil by weight. So over 600 sites generated contaminated soil in 2021. But from a waste reduction perspective, it's reasonable to look at those largest 76 generators. So this graph shows the breakdown by site authority of contaminated soil by weight of soil generated. 68% of soil generated was the projects outside of DTSC's oversight. That's in orange on the left. 23% were projects under DTSC's oversight, which is in green on the top right. And 9% were projects managed by DTSC or orphan sites. Now, actually, this entire 9% generated by orphan sites was from just one project in 2021, which was the Exide residential cleanup. So what this tells us is that the majority of contaminated soil generated in 2021 was not overseen by DTSC. This limits DTSC's influence on reducing soil generation. Next slide, please. So despite being the largest category of hazardous waste, we don't recommend contaminated soil as a candidate for substantial reduction. As I explained on the previous slide, DTSC does not have direct authority over a majority of contaminated soil generated. DTSC could enact policies to make it more expensive to excavate soil, but that could also discourage site cleanups. Cleanup of contaminated sites is of course beneficial because it minimizes the risk of exposure to hazardous chemicals and allows the land to be restored to use. And as I mentioned earlier, this is acknowledged in SB 158, which specifically states that reduction in hazardous waste generation is not to be achieved solely by reducing the removal of soil from contaminated sites. Discouraging cleanups is therefore going to be going against the plan requirements, which states that the risk to communities from contaminated sites is to be reduced. And this is also why we don't recommend attempting to reduce hazardous waste generation by a specific percentage each year. Percentage-based goals for hazardous waste reduction will be difficult to meet because the largest category of hazardous waste is not a great candidate for reduction. Next slide, please. Now, this isn't to say that contaminated soil waste can't be reduced at all. Treatment of soil should still be encouraged where possible, and some contaminants can be effectively treated. For example, soil vapor extraction can work well on volatile organic contaminants. However, some contamination is more difficult to treat. A lot of contaminated soil generated in California is hazardous due to low concentrations of heavy metals such as lead. Heavy metals are typically more difficult to treat than organic compounds because heavy metals can't be broken down. So therefore, excavation is often the preferred cleanup method. Also, some sites may have treatment options that are technically feasible, but still not viable. For example, if you've got a cleanup project and it's got a really tight timeline for construction, excavation provides a cleanup method that typically occurs in a predictable timeline and has a defined endpoint. Treatment of the soil may take longer and have a less predictable endpoint. DTSC does not want to create policies that discourage excavation if those policies discourage cleanups. Instead of focusing on reducing the amount of contaminated soil generated, we recommend shifting focus to limiting community impacts during cleanups. DTSC's Office of Brownfields is piloting the C3 initiative, which stands for Community Considerate Cleanups. And this is actually going to be the subject of a later workshop. But just as a quick introduction, they're creating a C3 quick reference guide for practitioners to use during cleanup planning and implementation. And that guide should be finalized this year. This guide will provide recommendations on ways to adopt a community lens when designing a cleanup and encourages the use of on-site treatment options when appropriate. When excavation is determined to be the most appropriate cleanup action, contractors are encouraged to minimize impacts to the community as much as possible. Some of these are remarkably simple, like one way to achieve impacts could be limiting the times that trucks carrying contaminated soil waste are leaving the site to hours outside of school pickup and drop-off times. Next slide, please. Another category of hazardous waste we considered for reduction is waste requiring incineration as treatment. Unlike contaminated soil waste, we recommend incinerable waste for reduction for several reasons. First, California has no commercial hazardous waste incinerators. So all hazardous waste requiring incineration gets sent out to facilities outside of the state. Even nationally, there aren't that many commercial hazardous waste incinerators, and there's currently a backlog in incinerating hazardous waste. Reducing the waste requiring incineration would therefore reduce the amount of waste sent out of state and place less strain on that already backlogged national system. Another reason that waste requiring incineration is a good candidate for reduction is that 78% of incinerable waste is RCRA hazardous. This means that it is hazardous federally and not just in California. This indicates that it is likely more hazardous than waste, which is only considered hazardous in California, since California's hazardous waste classification is both more stringent and broader in scope than the federal classification. This provides another incentive to try and reduce generation of incinerable waste. I don't want to imply here that substantial reductions could be achieved like the incinerable waste minimization project in the 90s, since, as Karen mentioned earlier, a lot of those reductions were because they did not have very good minimization processes before the project. That being said, a focus on incinerable waste could still result in small reductions. And I'm also going to do a whole separate workshop on incinerable waste in fall for those of you who are interested in the subject. Next slide, please. Alternative energy waste is another waste stream that we believe should be targeted for analysis. Alternative energy waste includes things like lithium-ion batteries from electric cars. Now, this is not a great candidate for source reduction because this is an important technology for California's future as we work towards reducing our carbon production. So we definitely don't want to discourage the use of electric cars just because they have lithium-ion batteries. That being said, at end of life, they still become hazardous waste. Recycling these materials would reduce the amount of waste needing to be disposed of and reduce our demand of the raw materials. Currently, permitting requirements on recycling facilities in California may be limiting the potential for recycling alternative energy waste in state. We recommend that DTSC create an interdisciplinary work group to compile information on lithium extraction and lithium-ion batteries. Non-governmental experts, such as members of the lithium-ion battery manufacturing or recycling industry, could be utilized to improve DTSC's understanding of this rapidly growing waste stream. Next slide, please. 2 additional plan requirements are: first, to consider changes to statutes that may create impediments to waste reduction, and second, to consider changes to Articles 11.8 and 11.9 specifically. Now, that second change to research revisions to 11.8 and 11.9 only makes sense if DTSC were to have a pollution prevention program again, since those articles provided strong guidance to the previous P2 program at DTSC. The first of these requirements to recommend changes to statutes that may create impediments to waste reduction is extremely broad and definitely is going to require some further analysis, though we do have some recommended areas of research. Next slide, please. The first area that we recommend researching is whether changes could be made to statute to promote a circular economy. In a traditional linear economy, products are used and become waste that must be disposed of. In a circular economy, generators reincorporate what would have been waste back into the production process to become products again. A circular economy minimizes the need for both raw materials and for waste disposal, which is especially important for processes that produce hazardous waste. Next slide, please. Now, as you could see on the diagram of the previous slide, recycling is a key component of a circular economy. Source reduction, of course, is very important, but recycling is still needed to get materials back into the production process when source reduction is not possible, instead of being disposed of. Some recycling can be done on site, but facilities dedicated to recycling are still needed. In California, facilities that recycle hazardous waste off-site need a permit, and if the process to get a permit can be difficult. It's actually unknown how long a new permit would take to process because no voluntary permit applications for new facilities have been received recently. The last new standardized permit application was received in 2014, but this was for the expansion of an existing facility. No new RCRA permit applications have been received in over 30 years. Also, DTSC's permit process is only one aspect of getting approval to build a facility, since there are also Tanner Act requirements. The time required is likely discouraging business owners from applying for permits for new facilities. Delays cost applicants money, and there are substantial requirements in terms of time and financial investments required before a recycling facility can even begin to operate. This is likely discouraging the construction of new recycling facilities. So one area of future research could be whether changes could be made to statute to encourage the development of hazardous waste recycling facilities, as this would help the state reach its circular economy goals. And my apologies about this slide. I'm not sure why it's not quite showing up correctly. The title should just say circular economy considerations. Next slide, please. Another area that we recommend be researched further is on-site treatment. On the waste management hierarchy, treatment is below source reduction and recycling. Treatment prior to disposal is still an important aspect of hazardous waste management. Right now, substantial on-site treatment is already occurring, but it is not directly quantified. If DTSC had better information about on-site treatment, it could encourage the treatment that is already occurring and encourage more on-site treatment. One way to do this would be to update the tiered permitting system. Lower tiered permits for some types of treatment only require notification to DTSC, not the lengthy approval process that I mentioned earlier. However, the types of treatment allowed under lower tiered permits are limited and have not been updated in years. Additional treatment technologies could be considered for inclusion in lower tiered permits, which would likely encourage more on-site treatment and require less waste to be shipped off-site for treatment or disposal. Yeah, sorry about this. We're not sure exactly what's causing the display issue on these slides. The title is just on-site treatment. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, SB 158 also requires recommended changes to Articles 11.8 and 11.9. These were the primary guidance behind DTSC's prior P2 program, but in 2013, most of the requirements of these statutes were removed. The only requirements that remain are generator reporting requirements. SB 14 reports are still produced by generators, but are no longer reviewed by DTSC. If there was adequate funding to bring a P2 program back to DTSC, it should be carefully considered how that program would look rather than try and bring it back exactly as it was in 2012. We recommend further research into the form a new P2 program would take and what changes would be needed to Articles 11.8 and 11.9. One thing we definitely recommend, though, that is if DTSC had a P2 program, it would take back review of the SB 14 reports. These are still being produced by generators, but are typically not being reviewed on a technical basis. Some CUPAs have indicated that they don't have the resources or the technical expertise to perform these reviews, and they had previously relied on the technical training and evaluation from DTSC. A future P2 program could have the technical expertise to review these reports and work with generators on source reduction of hazardous waste, as was previously done. Next slide, please. In summary, SB 158 requires considerations for statute changes both specifically related to DTSC's P2 program and more general changes to encourage waste and disposal reduction. We have areas of recommendation for future research, including encouraging recycling as part of a circular economy, as well as on-site treatment. However, additional resources would be needed to determine specific changes to statute. Additional resources would also be required if Articles 11.8 and 11.9 were revised and a new DTSC P2 program was created. Next slide, please. I mentioned that DTSC should consider revisions if it were to bring a pollution prevention program back. So let's look at some other current pollution prevention programs that DTSC could use as guidance. Next slide, please. Here in California, we have the Green Business Program, which provides technical assistance for small to medium-sized businesses. And as Karen mentioned earlier, this is a lot of the same functions that DTSC's P2 program used to perform. The Green Business Network works with businesses on hazardous waste reduction, but does not strictly focus on it. Instead, the Green Business Network also looks at reducing non-hazardous waste, greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and electricity use. Businesses that meet certain environmental requirements are then certified as green businesses. Anyone then, if you're looking for, say, an auto shop that is a certified green business, you can go on the California Green Business Network's website and search for an auto shop that is a certified green business near you. So that's nice. It's a nice way to promote businesses that have paid really good attention to their environmental practices. Next slide, please. An out-of-state example of a pollution prevention program is the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, or TURI. This is an independent agency in Massachusetts that collaborates with businesses by providing both technical assistance and grants. Unlike the Green Business Network, TURI focuses solely on source reduction of hazardous waste. As I discussed earlier in the presentation, source reduction typically includes recycling within a process, but not any other kind of recycling or treatment. Also, TURI is interesting in that it has a stated goal of protecting workers, since they face unique risks and are often at an even greater risk of exposure than community members surrounding the facility. And of course, source reduction benefits workers too. If less hazardous materials are used, which results in less hazardous waste generation, workers will have less risk at their jobs. It's important to note, though, that California does have different hazardous waste laws than Massachusetts. So the exact methodologies of TURI may not directly apply. So for example, they don't have the same classifications of non-RCRA waste as California does. So California identifies far more waste as hazardous. Next slide, please. Of course, we could not leave out the US EPA's pollution prevention program. The EPA program uses their strict definition of pollution prevention to only include source reduction, and that is the primary focus of the program, though other environmental goals can be minor considerations, just like the California Green Business Network considers, so things like carbon emissions and energy use. And the US EPA operates an absolutely massive program, and it's got over 24 million in grants over the current 2-year funding cycle. Like DTSC's former grant program, some grants do require cost sharings with the applicants, but in the current funding cycle, some of that cost sharing is being covered by the recently passed federal infrastructure bill. And the US EPA website has a wealth of information. If you want to look into it, it has a lot of information on their current projects. Next slide, please. So that leaves us with some key questions if we were to restructure a DTSC P2 program. First, how would the program focus only on source reduction, or would it address the entire waste management hierarchy and include recycling and treatment as well? Now, I'm sure you can tell by listening to this presentation that we recommend promoting the entire waste management hierarchy, so that not only waste generation is reduced, but also waste disposal. Another question to ask is whether other environmental goals outside of hazardous waste and disposal reduction should be considered, such as greenhouse gas or energy use reduction. And if we start talking about broadening the scope of a future program, it may also be worth considering whether it would make more sense to have a Cal EPA program that includes all environmental goals, while the DTSC program focuses just on hazardous waste. Now, of course, the scope of the program will inevitably be determined by funding. And grant programs, a common feature of many P2 programs, would require additional funding beyond what is needed to just operate the program. Next slide, please. In summary, there's a lot to consider if DTSC was to have a pollution prevention program. We recommend that these questions be considered so that DTSC can once again not just be a knowledge base, but a leader in pollution prevention. So at this point, we're interested in hearing from you. How could a DTSC P2 program best serve all Californians, and what functions would be most useful? Next slide, please. All right, well, with that, we are going to open up the floor to public feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Kayla. We have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and read them out. That way they will be part of the transcript. So forgive the fact that I'm just going to be reading verbatim. So our first question is coming from Marty Walters. One of the assumptions I hear is that non-RCRA waste is presumed to be less toxic / hazardous than RCRA waste. Has DTSC completed an analysis of the exclusions and exemptions in RCRA versus California law to determine whether waste not excluded or exempted in California are actually low risk / less toxic? Does DTSC know what proportion of non-RCRA waste comes from these categories or have a way of estimating that?
Hi, Marty. Thank you for the question. Oh, there. So to the first, I'll try and take them in order. So to the first one, presuming less toxic or hazardous than a RCRA waste, and this is kind of a generalization. I think if you're comparing soils, a RCRA hazardous soil, let's assume lead. I mean, we were talking about that. They're at different concentrations. And so the test under RCRA or the federal test captures less soil as hazardous than California's test in the wet, which results in what we've seen in that waste stream and contaminated soil. The non-RCRA waste is typically at lower concentrations. So looking at it like that, the RCRA waste has higher concentrations than typically in the non-RCRA. As the tests are slightly different, but they're both measuring the soluble fraction of the total waste that's in there. But if you consider now holding up the lead contaminated, non-RCRA lead contaminated soil compared to incinerable waste, which we were seeing largely is RCRA, just that designation doesn't necessarily indicate it. But if you drill down into what it is, ignite or the incinerable waste a lot of times is liquids, much more mobile than like a lead contaminant than lead in soil, and so it has the potential to be more harmful. Some of the considerations, there's numerous. Have we completed an analysis of the exclusions and exemptions in RCRA versus California law to determine whether waste excluded or exempted in California are actually low? No, and I mean that's something that could be done, is trying to understand those exclusions and exemptions and RCRA versus California, but that is a very deep dive that we'd have to talk about how to do. And then next piece was, does DTSC know what proportion of non-RCRA waste comes from these categories or have a way of estimating that? Oh, from the exclusions and exemptions? We'll have to take that one back. I'm not exactly sure. I'll have to go talk through it. And then another, can I just go ahead and read Alejandro's? The next one's from Marty as well.
Yeah, go right ahead.
All right. Marty's next comment and question was, you haven't talked a lot about universal waste in this workshop. Can you talk about how DTSC has considered opportunities for pollution prevention for universal waste? And to what extent do these wastes fall under safer consumer products? I'll start, and if you want to add.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have started talking about universal waste, and it gets a little nuanced. I think in there, the top waste stream is electronic devices that we see in universal waste. And we're trying to better understand what's going on in the rest of the, there's been some changes, I understand, in the EU that we're trying to wrap our heads around a little bit, and it may be resulting in less of the electronic devices being identified as hazardous, but it's kind of a moving, that waste stream is kind of moving. We have started talking to safer consumer products. There is overlap a lot of times in some universal waste or like household hazardous waste. A lot of those are products, and if they are used, they're being used for their proper or for what they're intended for. However, if they are discarded before they are all the way used, then that might fall under they might be identified as a hazardous waste under certain circumstances. So there is some overlap, and we have met with SAFER. We're trying to work on that that question in particular.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered all of it. Marty, you're absolutely right that is the primary area of overlap that we've identified between pollution prevention and safer consumer products is these universal wastes and household hazardous waste, since they possibly become hazardous waste, but they start out as products and they are directly in people's homes in a way that most of these hazardous wastes that we're talking about are not. I just wanted to put a little note here that it doesn't appear that the previous DTSC P2 program really looked too much at universal waste, but that's not to say that it shouldn't be considered if we are to move forward with DTSC potentially having a new program, and then it could definitely be one of the areas of expansion to look at those. But thank you very much for your question. And then next question from Kristen Gronlaw. If DTSC brings back a P2 program, how will it be funded? And this is an excellent question because, as pointed out, there is no funding for pollution prevention at this time. It was entirely redirected to the Safer Consumer Products Program. So this would be an item which requires additional funding. Next, we have from Peter Schultz-Allen. How does DTSC monitor the environment to identify problematic chemicals that are getting into the environment? And without that data, we don't know what to focus on. And, Alejandro? Oh, he's marking it as being answered live. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm not sure if DTSC, do we have that kind of environmental data?
I think to an extent we do, yes.
Okay.
I think there's numerous groups that would look at that. We have toxicologists that look at emerging constituents of concern. Our group is working to understand that as well, alongside with other partner units in our policy group. We also follow along with what US EPA is identifying as emerging contaminants. And there's a couple of different routes, and I can get more specific. Peter, I can get you some more specific information on that if you're curious about it. But there are a number of different entities within DTSC and outside that monitor and for problematic chemicals. Chemicals of emerging concern is the term I've heard used for them. All right, so I'll go ahead and read the next one. The circular economy also includes the middle category of refill and reuse, not just reduction and recycling. What is the role of DTSC in that second one of the 3 R's?
I could, this was actually one of the areas of DTSC's outreach efforts with the pollution prevention guidance manuals. It is, of course, source reduction is always preferred, and recycling is what we talk about, but just in terms of reusing things, on-site practices, if you have something that maybe can't be used for its intended first use, can it be reused, such as, say, a wash that can't be used in one process because it's been contaminated, but could be used in a secondary process. So that was a consideration for the prior P2 program. However, that kind of advice in terms of DTSC providing it to generators is definitely something that requires very solid knowledge of generator processes before those recommendations could be made.
Mickey Pierce, has DTSC considered removing non-RCRA or California-only contaminated soil from the definition of hazardous waste, but continuing to put higher levels of control on its handling? This could greatly reduce hazardous waste landfill capacity demands. Good question, Mickey. I'll take that one. One of the things we're required to do in this project is to consider specific non-RCRA waste streams for alternative management. Contaminated soil was one that was identified in a previous workshop by an attendee, and has been something that we are looking into. We started the review of the alternative management considerations by looking at landfills that are already accepting hazardous wastes of certain types. So treated wood waste is one example. There's 59 landfills that are allowed to receive treated wood waste. And we wanted to take a look through those designs and how are they constructed to understand what the modern day landfill looks like. What we found in that was that the vast majority of them have a double composite liner. Composite liner means it has a plastic and a clay. And that's the term composite. It either has 1, 2, or even 3 at some times. So we're working through that assessment, and we're actually planning a workshop around modern day landfills and considerations for alternative management, and non-RCRA contaminated soil is one of those waste streams that is we're looking at currently. Okay. I did not hear next comment from Mickey Pierce. I did not hear any discussion of how DTSC is going to take into account national manufacturing standards, i.e. mil specs, when developing strategies. Many times businesses flounder with P2 since product replacement is not allowed under manufacturing processes. Where is US EPA and collaboration on this? I'll start in that. This is a really interesting question and point, Mickey. Right now, we're at the beginning of this process. And I think this highlights one of the challenges that P2 programs have run into since they started because of manufacturing requirements or specs. Other entities that have requirements, other governmental entities that regulate certain industries have specific requirements, and that's why it's a very complicated subject to look into and to really drill down on. I think it's a really good question. So it is something that should be considered. US EPA and collaboration on that portion of the question. I don't know that we're quite at that point yet, but it is something that hopefully would be part of a program if it is brought back or reimagined, as we're talking about today. Do you want to?
Yeah, and thank you so much for your question, because that is an excellent point. And I'm aware that, there's national manufacturing standards. There's industries like pharmaceutical manufacturing that are so very tightly regulated that you can't just switch out one process for another just because it makes less hazardous waste. But at this time, as Ryan mentioned, this is very much the start of our pollution prevention process, and we would definitely want to get a better handle on how much hazardous waste generation is because of these national manufacturing standards. and also a cost benefit on whether these national manufacturing standards should be changed to reduce waste generation, because many of these manufacturing standards are in place for a good reason. So yeah, thank you so much for your question. But that's definitely something to consider for the future, but not necessarily in the very first steps of this process.
All right, and I failed to read the name of that last comment. So Mickey Pierce, thank you. Hopefully that got tagged for our transcripts. Sorry, Alejandro. Peter Schultz Allen was the next comment. I have heard that the EU has banned over 6,000 chemicals in the PFAS category that are problematic or toxic, while in the US, only 6 have been banned. What is DTSC doing in that area? I'll go ahead and take that one. Currently, we are following along with what US EPA is doing and what they're looking at. As US EPA identified in the last year, certain PFAS constituents have been marked as hazardous constituents, and that relates to cleanups. However, they're not currently required to be managed as a hazardous waste. We are following along with what the US EPA is looking at and following their evaluation closely. Okay, Mickey Pierce has the next comment. Does DTSC think that it will ever really solve hazardous waste disposal problems outside of actual prevention without expanding capacity? How do you do that in a state with this size with CEQA and NIMBYism? Let's see. Okay, I'll start with the first one, and then we can move into if anybody else wants to add anything else. Does DTSC think that it will ever really solve the hazardous waste disposal problems outside of actual prevention without expanding capacity? I think at some point, additional capacity will be needed. Obviously, if we're talking about landfilling, so disposal capacity here, at some point, disposal capacity will be maxed out. So at some point, there would likely need to be an expansion. Leave that one there. And then how do you do that in the size of this state with sequence? So we're talking about capacity issues and potential need for additional facilities. That's relates to our capacity topics. There are a number of topics that are within capacity itself that we're looking into. That's actually going to be a topic of our next workshop, is capacity and the balancing the demand of hazardous waste generation with the supply of management, appropriate management facilities. And there's a number of things that can be done in between. A large amount of waste is treated or recycled on site. I think the number that's sticking in my head is about 13 million tons annually is managed on site at the generator. And that's compared to what's managed off site. It's about 1.5 million tons on average annually. So it's a big difference. And so some things that we potentially or that we need to look at, exclusions and exemptions. Marty mentioned them earlier. It's something that that should be considered. There's numerous recycling exemptions that US EPA has adopted. In addition, there's California specific laws. One in particular is the Tanner Act, It was implemented in the previous effort for a hazardous waste management plan, and it also created some facility permitting requirements for local agencies to implement that tied to the larger state hazardous waste management plan. Where that state hazardous waste management plan, those requirements were modified or changed. They were removed when our project came in, and so there's some disconnect right now between some of those old requirements and some of the new requirements. So it's a long-winded way to say some of the laws and regulations that we currently have can be reviewed to make sure that they still make sense. So sorry for the long-windedness of that one. Something that we've been talking about recently. In addition, on-site, how do we can look at on-site treatment, additional ways for recycling. Are there new technologies available? Sorry,
Absolutely. I think you actually covered it all. Thank you.
Got on a roll.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I did it again. Sorry. That was Mickey Pierce. Sorry, Alejandro. Next up is Cynthia Babbage. Have you incorporated the recommendations in this report into the draft plan? A lot of what you are pondering has been pondered before. Please share this link with everyone to the report. And she linked the Community Protection Hazardous Waste Reduction Initiative report. Cynthia, I don't know if we have directly adopted any of the recommendations in there. This is a report that we're very familiar with. And I believe there are some recommendations that will rhyme, but we did not lift anything directly from that report and verbatim put it into a draft plan. The report is available on, if you Google Community Protection Hazardous Waste Reduction Initiative, and I think I'd prefer to link to a website instead of the Dropbox. So we can plop that link in the chat for those that are interested, or you can Google Community Protection Hazardous Waste Reduction Initiative. The next comment was from Marty Walters. Not a question, but general feedback. Great job on this presentation. Really appreciate that you're incorporating P2 into this larger project. Love to see consideration of the Coupa multi-program elements as you go forward, especially for small businesses. Education is an important component of this program overall, so that generators have a better understanding of how to strategically manage their hazardous waste to meet their business goals, reduce costs where opportunities exist, and reduce regulatory burden. On-site treatment definitely should be included in any program consideration. I also think considering the changes in the economy since the 1990s is critical in developing a strategy going forward. Great, thank you. Thank you for the comment, Marty. Next question was from Peter Schultz Allen. Was the precautionary principle mentioned in the webinar today? If DTSC has that as a policy, I think it does in the SCP program. Can you give an example of how it has been used recently? I can start with a quick answer. No, we did not mention the precautionary principle in our webinar today. And I am not aware of that policy. If SCP does or not, we can ask and confirm that if you would like us to, Peter. So I won't be able to give an example of that today because I'm not too sure. And just to update everybody in the chat, the Community Protection and Hazardous Waste Reduction Initiative report is now in the chat. There's a link in there. And we actually used and reviewed that report when we were developing ours. So there is similar information in it, and we took that as a starting point and tried to take it a bit further than what the report included. Okay. Does anybody have any other comments or questions? We're almost at time here, but we really appreciate the attendance here and all of the questions. Very good discussion. There is a post-workshop survey that we have. So if folks wouldn't mind filling that out. We've been using these to help us understand if the information that we're providing in these workshops is good, is good and succinct. Is it on target for specific topics that folks have wanted to hear more about? And we do have a couple of slides to close out. I can do that, or Kayla can.
I can go ahead and do it. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Spencer, the one after that. We'll be discussing just some really brief next steps. I know we're almost at time here. Just as a reminder from the beginning of the workshop, this is a, sorry, one more slide, please. Thanks. This is the current lineup of all the workshops that we have planned, finishing up the summer and moving into fall. So, and as mentioned earlier, those 3-day ranges are just us trying to finalize what the date of the workshop will be. So we look forward to having whoever is interested attend these future workshops with us. Next slide, please. And just as a final reminder, this is a link to the Hazardous Waste Management Plan website and a QR code for further information. Please join our e-list for updates if you are interested in them, and you're always free to email us at DTSC_HWPlan@dtsc.ca.gov. Next slide. So with that, I believe that there are no further comments or questions, but please do fill out that post-workshop survey. So thank you all so much for coming today.